Callum leaned back in his worn leather chair, the hum of the air conditioner filling the silence of his home office. His eyes lingered on the photo resting on the desk, a snapshot of Marisol and Leo taken during their last family trip to Cannon Beach. Their smiles seemed perfect then, genuine even, yet now those moments felt like distant memories wrapped in a fog of unease. Lately things were off. Callum couldn't pinpoint when it began, but Marisol's laughter no longer echoed through their home the way it used to. Their once vibrant conversations had faded into routine exchanges about schedules and groceries. Even the way she touched him, light brushes on his shoulder or a fleeting kiss on the cheek, felt mechanical, as if performed out of obligation. Tonight was supposed to be different. Callum had taken the time to cook her favorite dish, chicken marsala, a small attempt to rekindle the warmth they once shared. He glanced at the dining table where the plates sat untouched. Leo had already fallen asleep after finishing his portion, and Marisol? She was still out, working late, she'd said. Again. His gaze shifted to the clock. 9:43 p.m. It was becoming a pattern. At first he dismissed it as her dedication to her freelance graphic design work, the ebb and flow of creative deadlines. But now, doubt crept in, gnawing at his sense of security. The sound of keys jingling broke his thoughts. The front door creaked open and Marisol stepped in, her blonde hair slightly disheveled, a faint hint of perfume lingering in the air. Not hers. "Hey," she greeted, her tone brisk as she set her bag down by the door. "Sorry I'm late. The client wanted some last-minute changes." Callum forced a smile. "No worries. I saved you a plate." Marisol hesitated, her eyes darting toward the dining table. "Thanks, but I'm not really hungry. I'll just head up and shower." She disappeared upstairs before he could respond. Callum stared after her, the uneaten meal in front of him a bitter reminder of his growing helplessness. Something was wrong. He felt it in his gut, but he wasn't sure how to confront it without risking everything. The next morning, as the Oregon rain pattered against the windows, Callum prepared breakfast for Leo. The little boy chatted animatedly about a science project he'd started at school, his bright enthusiasm a stark contrast to the shadow hanging over Callum. He ruffled Leo's hair with a warm smile, determined not to let his doubts seep into the precious moments with his son. Marisol joined them briefly, her face pale and distant. She sipped her coffee in silence, responding to Leo's chatter with absent nods. When her phone buzzed, her demeanor shifted, tense, guarded. She stood abruptly, grabbing her coat. "I've got a meeting downtown," she said, barely making eye contact. "I'll be back later." "Another meeting?" Callum asked, his tone carefully neutral. "Yes," she replied curtly, then hesitated. "Why?" He held her gaze for a moment, searching for something, anything that might bridge the growing chasm between them. "Nothing. Drive safe." As the door closed behind her, Callum sat back, the weight of uncertainty settling heavily on his chest. He glanced at Leo, who was too engrossed in his cereal to notice his father's turmoil. Callum made a silent promise to himself. He would figure this out. He had to. For Leo, for the life they'd built, and for the truth that now felt as fragile as glass under pressure. The evening sky over Portland turned a muted gray, with raindrops tracing paths down the windows of the modest suburban home. Callum sat at the kitchen table, his hands wrapped around a steaming cup of coffee, staring blankly at the faint smudge on the tabletop. He had been trying to shake the unease gnawing at him, but each day seemed to add more weight to the feeling that something was slipping away. Marisol had left for another client meeting just an hour ago. The scent of her perfume, too heavy, too floral, still lingered in the room. It wasn't hers, not the one he'd gifted her for their anniversary last year. That small detail played on a loop in Callum's mind, a thread unraveling a larger truth he wasn't ready to face. Leo's laughter from the living room broke his trance. Callum peeked around the corner to see his son building a spaceship with blocks, his small hands moving with deliberate care. The sight filled Callum with a bittersweet warmth. Leo was his anchor, the reason he couldn't let his suspicions take over completely. Not yet. "Daddy, look!" Leo held up his creation proudly. "It's going to Mars!" "That's amazing, buddy," Callum said, forcing a smile. "Mars better watch out." But even as he spoke, his mind drifted. Mars felt closer than Marisol these days. Later that night, after tucking Leo into bed, Callum found himself in the laundry room, folding clothes mechanically. Marisol's favorite blouse was there, the pale blue one she always wore for important meetings. A faint stain near the collar caught his eye. Lipstick. Not her shade. His chest tightened as his mind raced through possibilities. His hands trembled slightly and the blouse slipped to the floor. The next day, Callum decided to check her car. It was a desperate move, and he hated himself for the distrust it symbolized. As he opened the glove compartment, a receipt fluttered out. It was from a high-end restaurant downtown, dated 2 nights ago. The signature wasn't hers. He sank into the driver's seat, clutching the paper. A wave of nausea swept over him. He tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was for work, maybe it was nothing, but the doubts were louder than reason. When Marisol returned that evening, Callum watched her closely. She was cheerful, overly so, her laughter too loud and her movements too animated. She kissed him lightly on the cheek, a gesture that felt rehearsed. "How was your meeting?" he asked, keeping his voice steady. "Good, just busy," she replied, avoiding his gaze as she busied herself with her phone. The phone. It had become her constant companion. Even during dinner, she kept it close, glancing at it every few minutes. Callum's stomach twisted every time the screen lit up. As they cleaned up the kitchen together, he tried again. "You've been working a lot lately. Everything okay?" Marisol paused, her hands gripping the edge of the counter. "Yeah, it's just a demanding client. You know how it is." Her words were calm, but her body betrayed her, shoulders tense, eyes darting. Callum nodded, though his gut told him otherwise. That night he lay awake in bed while Marisol slept beside him. The gap between them felt cavernous, an unspoken truth casting its shadow over their once shared intimacy. He turned to look at her, studying her face in the dim light. She seemed peaceful, unburdened. How? How could she sleep so soundly while his mind was a storm of doubts? As the hours ticked by, Callum made a decision. He couldn't confront her yet, not without more than a receipt and a feeling. If he was wrong, it could shatter the fragile peace they still had. But if he was right... Callum swallowed hard, his throat dry with the weight of the thought. If he was right, then he needed to be prepared. Callum's breath caught as he sat alone in the dim glow of his living room. The house was silent, save for the occasional creak of the floorboards and the soft patter of rain against the windows. His phone was in his hand, open to a messaging app he'd never seen before. Marisol's phone had buzzed earlier when she'd left it on the kitchen counter to grab something upstairs, and curiosity had gotten the better of him. He stared at the screen, his pulse quickening. The message read, "Last night was unforgettable. Can't wait to see you again soon. Same place." The sender's name was Kieran, and beside it was a photo of a man Callum didn't recognize. Young, athletic, his grin confident, almost cocky. Callum's fingers hovered over the screen, his mind racing. He knew this wasn't some work-related exchange. The language, the tone, it was too personal. Before he could think better of it, Callum opened the chat. Messages scrolled up, each one like a needle piercing his chest. They were filled with inside jokes, teasing remarks, and subtle hints of physical intimacy. The timestamps painted a picture of frequent secret conversations. He felt his stomach churn as he read a particular message from a few days ago. "I still can't believe you snuck out that fast. I'll keep the seat warm for next time." Marisol's footsteps on the stairs jolted him back to reality. His heart pounded as he quickly set her phone down where it had been and pretended to scroll through his own. She entered the room, her face lit up with a warm smile that now felt like a dagger to him. "Hey, Callum, still up?" she asked, her voice light and carefree. He forced a nod, his throat dry. "Yeah, just couldn't sleep." She leaned down, kissed his cheek, and murmured, "Don't stay up too late. I need you well rested for tomorrow." Callum didn't respond, his mind too consumed by what he'd just discovered. The weight of the truth pressed down on him, but he knew he couldn't confront her now. Not yet. The next morning, Callum's routine felt heavier than usual. Every interaction with Marisol was colored by the knowledge of her betrayal. When she kissed Leo goodbye and left for her client meeting, Callum watched her drive away, his jaw tight. He decided to investigate further. The messages were damning, but they weren't enough. not for what he was planning. If Marisol was going to lie to him, he needed proof so undeniable that she couldn't twist her way out of it. That afternoon, while Leo played in the backyard, Callum accessed their shared cloud account. Marisol's phone synced automatically, and he was able to pull up photos and locations. His hands shook as he clicked through the folders. There were photos of her at restaurants he'd never been to, selfies with Kieran, and even screenshots of hotel reservations. One folder stood out. It was titled Work. Callum hesitated before opening it, hoping against hope that it was exactly what it claimed to be. But it wasn't. Inside were more photos, candid shots of Marisol and Kieran, intimate and unmistakable. His heart broke as he stared at the images, the reality of her actions crushing him. As Callum closed the laptop, a single tear slipped down his cheek. He wiped it away quickly, as if trying to erase the weakness it represented. He didn't have time to fall apart, not when there was so much at stake. His son's laughter echoed from outside, a bittersweet reminder of the innocence he needed to protect. Callum took a deep breath, steeling himself. This was no longer just about him and Marisol. It was about Leo, their life, and the truth that would soon come to light. He wasn't ready to confront her yet, but he was ready to take the first step toward uncovering everything. Callum sat alone in his car, the rain tapping rhythmically on the windshield as he stared at the device in his hand. It was a small, unassuming GPS tracker, a last-minute purchase he'd picked up from an electronics store earlier that day. The box promised peace of mind, but the reality of what he was about to do filled him with dread. This wasn't about peace anymore. This was war. Marisol had left that morning, her demeanor unusually light as she mentioned an impromptu meeting with a new client. Callum didn't believe a word of it. He'd watched her pack a tote bag she never used for work, her movements quick and deliberate, as though she knew time was against her. Now, with the tracker synced to his phone, Callum sat in the driver's seat, waiting for her car to leave the driveway. The moment it disappeared around the corner, he followed at a safe distance, his heart pounding with every mile. The GPS pinged steadily, leading him through the heart of Portland, past the familiar landmarks of their shared life, until the roads turned quieter, more secluded. She finally stopped at a small boutique hotel on the city's outskirts, a place Callum had never heard her mention. He parked a block away, his breath shallow as he tried to piece together what he was about to find. He thought of Leo, his innocent laughter filling the house just this morning. How would he explain this to his son if it came to that? The thought drove a spike of determination through his chest. Through the rain-slicked streets, Callum approached the hotel. He caught sight of Marisol stepping out of her car, her head turning as if to check for anyone watching. She wore a deep red coat he didn't recognize, her blonde hair tucked neatly into a loose bun. Callum stayed hidden, his fists clenching as she walked briskly toward the entrance, where a man, Kieran, was waiting. The two exchanged a brief hug before heading inside. That small gesture was the confirmation Callum didn't want but had expected. He took a deep breath and pulled out his phone, capturing a few photos from his position. His hands shook as he adjusted the zoom, but he steadied himself enough to get the proof he needed. Once they disappeared into the hotel, Callum hesitated. Part of him wanted to storm inside, to confront them in front of everyone and tear down whatever lies Marisol had built around their life. But the other part of him, the part that had spent countless nights staring at Leo's sleeping face, promising to protect him, knew that wasn't the answer. Not yet. Instead, Callum walked back to his car, rain dripping from his coat as he sat behind the wheel. The photos on his phone stared back at him, undeniable evidence of Marisol's betrayal. His mind raced with questions, but one thought rose above them all. What now? That night, Marisol returned home late, her smile bright as she set her bag by the door. "Sorry, it went longer than I thought," she said casually, as though nothing had changed. Callum nodded, forcing a neutral expression. "No problem. Did you at least get everything done?" Her eyes flickered briefly, almost imperceptibly, before she replied, "Yes, it went well." Callum felt his stomach turn at the lie. He wanted to shout, to throw the photos in her face and demand an explanation, but he held back, the weight of the truth anchoring him. He needed more than confrontation. He needed closure. As Marisol headed upstairs to shower, Callum sat at the dining table, staring at his phone. The photos, the GPS tracker logs, and the hotel receipt he'd found in her bag earlier that week. All of it formed a story he never wanted to believe. His mind drifted to Leo, asleep upstairs, blissfully unaware of the storm brewing beneath their roof. For his sake, Callum resolved to play the long game. This wasn't about anger anymore. This was about justice, and ensuring the life they'd built wouldn't crumble under the weight of Marisol's choices. Callum sat in his office late at night, the only light coming from his laptop. On the screen, neatly organized folders labeled photos, texts, and logs stared back at him. Each one contained pieces of the puzzle, a puzzle he never wanted to solve but couldn't ignore. He had spent hours compiling every detail, every shred of evidence he could find, into an airtight case against Marisol. The work had left him exhausted, but the fire in his chest burned too hot to stop. This wasn't just about confronting her. Confrontation was messy, emotional, and easily turned against you. No, Callum needed something decisive, something she couldn't twist into her own narrative. This was about reclaiming control, not just of their relationship, but of his life. He opened his email and began drafting a message to Mr. Fernandez, the small business owner who occasionally hired Marisol for freelance work. Carefully, Callum phrased his words, keeping the tone polite yet pointed. He attached a few of the less intimate photos, ones that clearly showed Marisol with Kieran but avoided graphic details. He didn't want to humiliate her, just establish the truth. He hesitated for a moment before hitting send, his chest tightening. He didn't know what would come of it, but it was a start. The next step required precision. The following morning, while Marisol showered, Callum accessed her laptop under the guise of checking their shared calendar. He quickly navigated to her email, noting several exchanges with Kieran. One in particular caught his eye, a draft for a hotel booking confirmation. He took a screenshot, then quietly returned everything to its original state. At breakfast, Marisol appeared as though nothing was wrong, laughing with Leo as she poured syrup over his pancakes. Her carefree demeanor infuriated Callum. How could she sit there, so casual, while everything they had built was unraveling? "Marisol," he said, his tone measured, "what's your schedule like this week? Anything I should know about?" She looked up, her smile faltering for a brief moment. "Oh, just the usual. A few meetings here and there. Why?" Callum shrugged, sipping his coffee. "Just curious. Thought we might try to plan a family night." Her relief was almost palpable, and she quickly nodded. "That sounds great. Let me know what works." The rest of the day was uneventful, but Callum's mind was anything but quiet. He called his brother Dominic that afternoon, his voice low as he explained the situation. Dominic listened carefully, his anger evident in the sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line. "You're sure about this, Cal?" Dominic asked. "I have the proof, Dom. This isn't just paranoia. She's been lying for months." Dominic paused, then said firmly, "All right, whatever you need, I'm here." Callum's next move was risky. That evening, while Marisol prepared dinner, he installed a discreet camera in the living room. The device was small, blending seamlessly with their decor. He didn't feel good about spying, but he needed undeniable evidence of her deceit. The following day, Callum watched the footage on his phone while sitting in his car during lunch. It was like a dagger to the heart. Marisol had invited Kieran into their home while he was at work. Their interaction was casual but intimate. Shared laughter, a kiss on the couch, a familiarity that made Callum's blood boil. He slammed his fist against the steering wheel, his breath ragged. This wasn't just about her betrayal anymore. This was about protecting Leo from the lies and instability Marisol was weaving into their lives. Callum knew what he had to do. That night, as Marisol kissed him goodnight, Callum lay awake, his mind racing. The revenge plan was no longer just an idea, it was in motion, and he would stop at nothing to ensure justice for himself and Leo. Callum stood in the center of the living room, his hands trembling slightly as he gripped the tablet displaying the damning footage. The air in the house was heavy, oppressive, as though the walls themselves held their breath for what was about to unfold. The digital clock on the wall ticked louder than it ever had before, each second dragging out his anticipation. Marisol walked in from the kitchen, her casual smile faltering when she saw him standing there, his expression unreadable. She held a glass of wine in her hand, the deep red liquid swirling lazily as she stopped in her tracks. "What's wrong?" she asked, her voice cautious, tinged with uncertainty. Callum didn't respond immediately. Instead, he turned the tablet toward her, hitting play. The video came to life, showing her and Kieran sitting on their couch, their laughter and intimacy captured in vivid clarity. The moment she kissed him, Marisol's face went pale, the glass slipping from her hand and shattering on the floor. Her eyes darted between the screen and Callum, her mouth opening and closing as if searching for words. Finally, she managed a weak, "Callum, I can explain." "Explain what, Marisol?" Callum's voice was calm, but it carried a weight that made her flinch. "Explain why the man you've been lying to me about was sitting in our living room? Why you kissed him while our son was asleep upstairs?" "It's not what it looks like," she stammered, stepping closer, her hands raised as though to calm him. I was going to tell you, I swear." Callum let out a bitter laugh, the sound sharp and jagged. "Tell me. When, Marisol? Before or after you decided to bring him into our home? How long were you planning to keep this charade going?" She hesitated, her composure crumbling under his unrelenting gaze. "I didn't mean for it to happen," she whispered, tears welling in her eyes. It just did. That's not good enough." Callum's voice cracked, the pain he had been holding back finally breaking through. "Do you have any idea what this has done to me? To us? To Leo?" At the mention of their son, Marisol's tears spilled over. "Callum, please. I love you. I love our family. I made a mistake, but it doesn't change how much I care about you and Leo." Callum shook his head, his jaw tightening. "Love? You don't do this to someone you love. You don't lie to their face, betray their trust, and then act like it's just a mistake. You made choices, Marisol, choices that destroyed everything." Her knees buckled, and she sank to the floor, sobbing. "I'll do anything to fix this," she pleaded. "Anything. Just tell me what to do." Callum stood over her, his heart heavy but resolute. "There's no fixing this," he said quietly. "You need to leave." Marisol's head shot up, panic flashing in her tear-streaked eyes. "Leave! Callum, no, please, we can work through this, for Leo." He took a deep breath, his voice steady despite the storm inside him. "For Leo's sake, I'm not going to argue with you. Pack your things, Marisol. I'll make sure you can see him, but you can't stay here anymore." She reached out to grab his hand, but he stepped back, the space between them feeling insurmountable. "Callum, please don't do this." "I didn't do this, Marisol," he replied, his voice hollow. "You did." For the first time, the weight of her action seemed to sink in. She nodded slowly, her shoulders sagging as the reality of the situation bore down on her. Without another word, she stood and walked upstairs, her steps heavy with defeat. Callum remained in the living room staring at the shattered glass on the floor. The house felt quieter than it ever had before, the silence ringing in his ears. He didn't know what came next, but for the first time in weeks, he felt a sliver of clarity. This was the beginning of something new, even if it meant starting over from the ruins. Callum sat across from his lawyer, an older man named Marcus Reeves, whose sharp eyes seemed to pierce through every word he spoke. The office was sterile, lined with shelves of legal books and framed certificates. It felt impersonal, but Callum wasn't here for comfort. He was here for a plan. "This won't be easy," Marcus began, leaning back in his chair. "Oregon is a no-fault state. That means Marisol's infidelity won't guarantee you a better settlement. The courts are going to focus on what's best for Leo." Callum nodded, his jaw tightening. "I don't care about the money. I care about my son. I need to make sure Marisol doesn't take him away from me." Marcus raised an eyebrow. "Do you have proof she's unfit as a parent?" Callum hesitated. He thought of the videos, the photos, the lies. "I have proof she's been reckless," he said carefully. "Bringing a stranger into our home while Leo was asleep upstairs. That counts for something, doesn't it?" Marcus nodded. "It could help. Judges don't look kindly on behavior that compromises a child's safety. But it's not a slam dunk. We'll need to be strategic." Callum's stomach churned at the word. Strategy. It made everything feel cold, calculated. But he knew this wasn't the time for sentiment. "What do we do?" Marcus pulled out a legal pad, jotting down notes as he spoke. "First, we'll file for a temporary restraining order, limiting Marisol's access to the house. That gives us time to stabilize things for Leo. Second, we'll need to document everything, her movements, her interactions with Kieran, any signs of instability. Callum clenched his fists. What about custody? Marcus sighed. That's the tough part. Courts tend to favor joint custody unless there's a clear reason not to. But if we can prove Marisol's actions put Leo at risk, we might be able to secure primary custody. The words clear reason echoed in Callum's mind. How could the courts not see what was already so obvious to him? His son's safety was non-negotiable. Do you think she'll fight me on this? Callum asked, his voice low. Marcus smirked. If history is any indicator, yes. People like Marisol don't like losing control, but that's why you hired me. Later that evening, Callum returned home to an empty house. Marisol had taken a few things and left, honoring his demand from the night before. The silence was deafening, the absence of her presence both a relief and a reminder of what they had lost. He went upstairs to check on Leo, who was fast asleep under his favorite dinosaur blanket. Callum sat on the edge of the bed, brushing a hand through his son's soft curls. This was why he was fighting. Not for revenge, not out of anger, but for the boy who trusted him to make the right decisions. The next morning, Marisol called. Her voice was shaky, but composed. Callum, I don't want this to get ugly. Then don't make it ugly, he replied, his tone steady. I still want to be a part of Leo's life, she said softly. We can figure this out without lawyers, can't we? Callum gripped the phone tighter, his mind flashing to her lies, her betrayal, her audacity to act as if she still had control. This stopped being about us a long time ago, Marisol. It's about Leo now, and I'll do whatever it takes to protect him. Her silence on the other end of the line was deafening. Finally, she whispered, I guess I'll see you in court. The line went dead, leaving Callum staring at the phone. His heart ached, but his resolve was stronger than ever. This wasn't just a fight for custody. It was a fight for Leo's future, for his safety, for the life Callum knew his son deserved. The courtroom was colder than Callum had expected, both in temperature and atmosphere. He sat at the long wooden table with Marcus by his side, the lawyer meticulously shuffling through papers as if every detail held the weight of the world. Across the room, Marisol sat with her attorney, her face pale but composed. Her gaze avoided Callum's, a thin veil of dignity masking the storm he knew was brewing beneath. Are you ready for this? Marcus asked, his voice low enough to be heard only by Callum. Callum nodded, though his stomach churned. I don't have a choice. When the judge entered, a stern-looking woman with sharp eyes and a commanding presence, the room fell silent. She took her seat, her gavel resting lightly in her hand as she surveyed the room. Let's proceed, she said, her tone leaving no room for hesitation. Marisol's lawyer, a polished man in an expensive suit, was the first to speak. Your Honor, my client is a dedicated mother who has made sacrifices to provide a loving home for her child. While the plaintiff may claim otherwise, we believe the evidence will show that granting joint custody is in the best interest of the child. Callum clenched his fists under the table, resisting the urge to react. He knew the game they were playing, painting Marisol as the victim while subtly undermining his credibility. He glanced at Marcus, who gave him a reassuring nod before standing. Your Honor, Marcus began, his voice steady and firm. We acknowledge the importance of both parents in a child's life. However, the plaintiff's evidence will demonstrate a pattern of reckless behavior on the part of the defendant, behavior that puts the child's emotional and physical well-being at risk. The judge's eyes narrowed slightly. Proceed. One by one, the evidence was presented. The photos, the text messages, the GPS logs, all of it painted a picture that couldn't be ignored. Marisol shifted uncomfortably in her seat as the damning details came to light, her lawyer occasionally objecting but never able to discredit the overwhelming proof. Callum's heart ached as he watched her crumble under the weight of her choices. This wasn't how he had wanted it to be, not for Leo, not for her. But the truth had to come out. When it was Marisol's turn to testify, her voice trembled as she tried to explain. I made mistakes, she admitted, her hands clutching the edges of the witness stand. But I love my son. Everything I've done, even the bad decisions, came from a place of feeling lost, not from a lack of love. Her words hung in the air, and for a moment Callum felt the faintest flicker of sympathy. He knew she loved Leo, he had never doubted that, but love alone wasn't enough to excuse what she had done. Then it was Callum's turn. As he took the stand, he felt every pair of eyes in the room on him. He drew a deep breath, steadying himself. "I didn't want this," he began, his voice heavy with emotion. "I wanted us to be a family, for Leo to have the stability and love he deserves. But Marisol made choices that broke that foundation. She brought someone into our home, a stranger, while our son was asleep upstairs. That's not a mistake. That's a betrayal." He paused, his eyes locking with Marisol's for the first time that day. "Leo deserves better. He deserves a safe, stable environment, and that's what I'm fighting for." When the judge finally spoke, her words were measured, deliberate. "This is a difficult case, and it's clear both parties care deeply for their child. However, the evidence presented shows a level of recklessness that cannot be ignored. I'm awarding primary custody to the plaintiff, with visitation rights for the defendant." The gavel struck, sealing the decision. Marisol's face crumpled as the reality set in, tears spilling down her cheeks. Callum felt no victory in the outcome, only a hollow sense of resolve. This wasn't about winning, it was about protecting Leo. As the courtroom emptied, Callum stood alone, his heart heavy but his purpose clear. For Leo, he would endure anything, even the pain of watching Marisol walk away. Marisol sat on the edge of a twin-sized bed in the sparsely furnished room of the halfway house. The curtains were thin, allowing slivers of gray Portland light to filter through, casting muted shadows on the walls. It was far from the home she had shared with Callum and Leo, the walls that once held family photos and laughter. Now it felt as though her life was as hollow as the empty shelves surrounding her. Her phone vibrated on the nightstand. She glanced at the screen. Another missed call from Kieran. She ignored it, the weight of his name heavier than she could bear. He wasn't a part of her life anymore, just like so many things she'd lost. Marisol leaned back, her gaze drifting to the cracks in the ceiling. She thought about the courtroom, the cold finality of the judge's gavel as it struck. Callum's words still echoed in her mind. Leo deserves better. They had pierced her, sharp and unyielding, leaving wounds she didn't know how to heal. She had fought to keep her composure that day, but now the tears fell freely, carving paths down her cheeks as she clutched the pillow tightly to her chest. She didn't blame Callum for what he'd done. How could she? She'd handed him the evidence, gift-wrapped in her own selfishness and mistakes. Still, the emptiness of losing Leo, of losing everything, was unbearable. When she finally forced herself out of bed, she shuffled toward the small mirror above the dresser. Her reflection startled her. Her hair was unkempt, streaks of gray beginning to show. Her face, once vibrant, was etched with exhaustion and regret. She barely recognized the woman staring back at her. "Who are you now, Marisol?" she whispered, her voice breaking. "What's left of you?" In the days following the court ruling, Marisol tried to find purpose, though it often felt futile. She took a part-time job cleaning offices, work that left her hands raw and her pride bruised. She walked past parents holding their children's hands, the sight of it stabbing her heart like a knife. Every smile reminded her of what she'd lost, of Leo's small arms wrapped around her neck, his laughter filling the house. One day she worked up the courage to write a letter to Callum. The words came slowly, each one pulled from a place of deep pain and humility. "Callum," she began, "I know I'm the reason for this. I know I betrayed you in ways that can't be undone. But please, don't let Leo forget me. Tell him I love him. Tell him I'm trying to be better for him." She didn't expect a response, but she sent it anyway, hoping the words might reach the part of Callum that still remembered the good times they once shared. Weeks passed, and her life settled into a monotonous routine. She spoke to Leo during their scheduled calls, his voice bright but distant. He told her about school, about the soccer team Callum had signed him up for. The pride in his voice was a bittersweet reminder of the father Callum had become, a role Marisol had once taken for granted. One evening, after finishing her shift, Marisol returned to the halfway house to find an envelope waiting for her. Inside was a photo of Leo holding a soccer trophy, his grin wide and genuine. On the back, Callum had written, "He wanted you to see this." Marisol clutched the photo to her chest, tears streaming down her face. It wasn't forgiveness, but it was something. A small gesture that told her she hadn't been entirely erased from her son's life. That night, as she stared at the photo, Marisol made a promise to herself. She would find a way to rebuild, not for Callum or for the life they'd lost, but for Leo, for the chance to someday prove that she could be the mother he deserved. Marisol sat at the edge of the community center stage, clutching a notebook filled with hastily scribbled lesson plans. Around her, a handful of women and children laughed softly, painting clay ornaments and stringing beads for bracelets. It was a volunteer program she'd signed up for months ago, a small step toward rebuilding her shattered life. Yet each session felt like both penance and salvation. Her life had become a collection of small, deliberate choices. A part-time cleaning job had turned into a full-time position as a supervisor at a local business, and she'd enrolled in evening classes at the community college to earn a certificate in counseling. The irony wasn't lost on her, helping others navigate their struggles while her own failures still clung to her like a second skin. But the work brought her something she hadn't felt in years: purpose. As the session wound down, Marisol walked outside into the brisk evening air, her breath visible in the glow of the streetlights. She pulled her jacket tighter and glanced at her phone. No new messages. The lack of contact from Callum was no surprise, but it still stung. Their interactions were limited to short, factual texts about Leo, always punctuated with a finality that kept her at arm's length. Her phone buzzed and her heart leapt before she saw the name. It was Dominic. "Hey," she answered, her voice steady but cautious. Calls from Callum's brother were rare. "Marisol," Dominic began, his tone gruff but not unkind. "Leo's soccer team has a game tomorrow. He's been asking if you'll come." Marisol's throat tightened. "Callum didn't tell me." "Yeah, well, he's not thrilled about it," Dominic admitted. "But the kid wants you there. Just keep it about him, all right?" "I will," she promised, tears pricking her eyes. "Thank you." The next day, Marisol arrived at the park early, parking her car far from the crowded lot. She watched from a distance as parents set up chairs and passed out snacks. When she finally spotted Leo warming up with his team, her heart swelled. He had grown taller, his movements more confident. It was a bittersweet realization. She was missing so much. As the game started, she stayed near the back, her presence quiet and unobtrusive. But Leo saw her almost immediately. His face lit up, and he waved enthusiastically before running back to his teammates. That one moment of recognition filled Marisol with more warmth than she thought possible. At halftime, she kept her distance until Leo came bounding over, his cleats clumping noisily on the pavement. "Mom, did you see my goal?" "I did," she said, kneeling to hug him. "You were amazing, sweetheart." He pulled back, his eyes bright. "You'll come to the next one, right?" Before she could answer, Callum appeared, his expression unreadable. He stood a few feet away, his arms crossed, as he watched the interaction. Marisol straightened, her heart pounding. "Callum," she said softly, "thank you for letting me come." He didn't respond right away, his gaze flicking between her and Leo. "He wanted you here," he finally said, his tone neutral. "That's what matters." Marisol nodded, knowing better than to push. She turned back to Leo, her smile genuine. "I'll be at the next game, I promise." After the game, as the crowd dispersed, Marisol lingered by her car, watching Callum and Leo load up their things. Callum caught her eye and hesitated before walking over. "You're trying," he said quietly. "I can see that." Marisol's breath caught. "I am. For him. For both of you." Callum gave a small nod, his expression softening just enough to give her hope. "Keep it up." As he walked away, Marisol stood in the fading light, her heart both heavy and light. Redemption wouldn't come easily, and she wasn't sure if Callum's forgiveness was even possible. But for the first time, she felt a glimmer of something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in a long time: hope. The morning sun filtered through the curtains of Callum's kitchen, casting warm patches of light on the table where he sat with a cup of coffee. Across from him, Leo was scribbling furiously in a workbook, his tongue poking out in concentration. The scene was calm, almost serene, but Callum knew better than to trust it. Life, he had learned, had a way of shifting when you least expected it. "Done," Leo exclaimed, holding up his worksheet for Callum's approval. "Let's see," Callum said, leaning forward. "All correct. Nice job, buddy." Leo grinned, the pride in his expression a balm for Callum's weary soul. For all the turmoil of the past year, moments like these reminded him of why he fought so hard to protect their world. The doorbell rang, interrupting the quiet. Callum stood, his chest tightening slightly. He wasn't expecting anyone. As he opened the door, his breath caught. Marisol stood there, a small, hesitant smile on her face. She held a plastic container of cookies, the awkwardness in her posture betraying her nerves. "I baked these with the kids at the community center," she said, her voice soft. "Thought Leo might like some." Callum hesitated before stepping aside. "Come in." Marisol entered slowly, her eyes darting around the familiar space. It looked the same, yet different. Subtly rearranged, stripped of the pieces of her that once filled it. She set the cookies on the counter and turned to see Leo bounding toward her. "Mom!" he yelled, wrapping his arms around her waist. "Hi, sweetheart," she said, crouching to his level. "I missed you. I missed you too. Did you see my trophy?" Leo's voice was bright as he pointed to the shelf where his latest soccer trophy gleamed. Marisol's face lit up, genuine pride replacing her nervousness. "I did," she said. "You're amazing, you know that?" Callum watched the exchange from a distance, his arms crossed. There was a time when seeing Marisol with Leo would have filled him with warmth, but now it only left a bittersweet ache. She was trying, he could see that, but trust was a delicate thing, easily shattered and slow to rebuild. When Leo ran off to retrieve another prized possession to show his mom, Marisol turned to Callum. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for letting me see him." "You don't have to thank me," Callum replied, his voice even. "He needs his mom." Her eyes glistened, but she blinked quickly, pushing back the emotion. "I'm trying, Callum, I really am." "I know," he said after a pause, "but it's going to take time." The honesty in his voice stung, but she nodded, accepting it. She glanced around the room, memories of their life together surfacing with every familiar detail. "It's hard being here," she admitted, her voice trembling. "But it's good too, to see him, to see you." Callum sighed, running a hand through his hair. "This is what's best for him. That's all that matters." Their conversation was interrupted by Leo's return, a pile of drawings clutched in his hands. Marisol sat with him at the table, her laughter ringing out as he described each one. Callum leaned against the counter, watching them with a mixture of relief and sadness. When it was time for her to leave, Marisol hugged Leo tightly, promising to see him at his next game. As she stood at the door, she turned back to Callum. "Do you think we'll ever find peace?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Callum held her gaze for a long moment before answering. "Maybe, but it's going to be fragile." Marisol nodded, a faint smile crossing her lips. "Fragile is better than nothing." As the door closed behind her, Callum sat back down at the table, his coffee cold but his resolve warm. Life would never be the same, but maybe, just maybe, it could still be good. What do you think of Callum's journey and Marisol's attempts at redemption? From which region are you watching this video? Let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications to stay updated with all our stories. And make sure to check out more heartwarming and dramatic tales by clicking here on the end screen. See you in the next story.